Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we're going to discuss, we're going to look at what is happening right now in Bakhmut. I also want to touch on and or rehash the events that took place in Bucha, northwest of Kiev at the start of the conflict. So first, as we continue to see this brutal meat-grinding battle that is taking place in Bakhmut, the Russians continue this very, very persistent and ongoing operation designed to break into the city and drive the multitude of Ukrainian brigades out of that area in order to take over Bakhmut. And the fighting is reportedly to be brutal and incredibly heavy, with huge losses on both sides. We are seeing large-scale infantry battles, heavy artillery duels, tank attacks continuing in the area near Bakhmut. And we expect that this will continue until one side has simply had enough of the bloodletting and withdrawals. Will that be the Russians? Will it be the Ukrainians? Difficult to say at this point. This seems to be a battle, a blood sport, so to speak. It is about who can claim that they are victorious at this point. Not sure about the strategic value of seizing Bakhmut at this point, but it would seem, again, both sides have settled in to defend and or take the city at any cost. And it definitely is going to continue to just get worse as the Russians move closer and closer to the center of the town. Now, I was able to watch a fairly interesting piece by the New York Times about what happened in Bucha. And this is the town that is just south of Hostomel, where the Russian airborne and Spetsnaz forces initially landed in their failed efforts to then move south and seize control of Kiev. And I wanted to dive in and deep dive a little bit about the alleged civilian casualties, the death or the execution of Ukrainian territorial militia units that were fighting in the city. Depending on what source you are looking at, it's difficult to say how many people actually died. But I think most of you have seen the clips of the restrained Ukrainians that are laying dead in the street. And obviously, initial reports indicated that the Russians were executing Ukrainian civilians. But let's look at what probably happened. So we know that as the Russians prepared for this war, the Russians did not do a good job, by reports that we have, these are verified reports, did not do a good job in terms of preparing its forces, Russian forces, regular motorized rifle forces, even airborne forces, for the prospects that they would engage in some very, very serious fighting on their way to Kiev. It would appear that by Russian intel, they had articulated to its forces, to their forces, that they would probably not meet a lot of resistance. And that was very much far from the truth. The Russians met very heavy resistance, both from regular Ukrainian units, Ukrainian ground forces, Ukrainian National Guard, but they also met fairly significant resistance from Ukrainian territorial defense forces. A lot of these individuals, and a lot of them were operating in Bucha, they, for the most part, did not wear uniforms. Now, some of those units not wearing uniforms were interdispersed with Ukrainian regular National Guard units, police units, as the Russians attempted to enter the town. Again, Bucha, just south of Hostomel. During the Russian entry into this town of Bucha, they came under serious attack, their convoys. And these Russian units that were entering Bucha were VDV units, Russian airborne units. And these units, these Russian airborne units that entered Bucha were in very lightly armored vehicles, BMD-3s, BMD-4s, other light armored vehicles. The Ukrainians, laying in wait, anticipating these Russian columns, then ambushed these Russian columns, and the Russians took, at times, heavy casualties. Some of these engagement ranges, as you see this thoroughfare here, this road here, through the town of Bucha. The Ukrainian, you can call them partisans, insurgents, individuals not wearing military uniforms from these buildings, attacked these Russian military convoys. Now, these Russian armored vehicles that the Russians were using, BMD-4s, BMD-3s, other lightly armored vehicles, are simply not heavy enough to withstand the type of firepower that they were under. A Ukrainian 7.62 millimeter light machine gun firing at 30 to 50 meters at a lightly armed BMD-4 will most likely penetrate the hull. The turret of the BMD-4 is steel, but the hull is an aluminum alloy. And at 30 to 50 meters, with a light 7.62 machine gun hammering away at that hull, in all likelihood, it's going to penetrate. The Russians also were obviously not inside the vehicles at times, but their infantries were behind the vehicles, and those individuals too came under fire from these buildings, and that's where a lot of Russians were killed. And then compounding that, obviously, were the use of in-laws and javelins and RPG-7s and AT-4s and a host of other equipment that the Ukrainians were using against these Russian forces. So the Russians took an initial beating in its attempt to enter Bucha. Now look, that is not to say that what the Ukrainians did was wrong. If I was defending my hometown from an external threat that I perceived as an external threat, then yeah, I'm going to grab a rifle. In all likelihood, I'm not going to be in a uniform, and I'm going to engage those hostile forces that's invading my hometown. And that's what the Ukrainians were doing. Now, when you do that, when you cause the kind of casualties that the Ukrainians did against these Russian airborne forces, you have to understand that when they withdraw and if they come back after you've killed their comrades, their battle buddies, they're not going to take quarter on you. And that's what happened. These Ukrainian territorial defenders, who the very first engagements killed a lot of these Russian troops, were then taken prisoner. And from the Russian perception, these individuals were not protected under the rules of war. They were not uniformed. Now, I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying, from the Russian perception, these Ukrainian territorials who weren't wearing combat uniforms, they did not deem that they were worthy of certain Geneva protections. They were combatants not dressed in uniforms, assaulting Russian forces. You can see from the video documentation that's been released that in some of these buildings where the Russians captured these Ukrainian territorials, you'll see 7 or 8 of them come out of the basement of a single building. In all likelihood, they left their weapons there in the building, and you can see them all being marched out. These are all fighting age males. And then, after that, it looks like, in all probability, they could have been executed by Russian forces. But again, those Russian forces, those same Russian units, a few days earlier, again, were assaulted and in some cases executed by these Ukrainian territorials. It's the nature of war. That's my point. This is going to happen. It's happened in other conflicts. It's happened in Iraq. It's happened in Afghanistan. It's happened in World War II by all parties involved. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it lawful, but it is what happens, unfortunately, in war. These Russian paratroopers saw their cohorts killed in battle by these Ukrainian territorials, and they felt that they were doing their duty by killing the Ukrainian territorials the very next day. That's what happened. Now, is it possible that some of these could have been actual non-combatants, that some of these could have been civilians? Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's just what happens in war. And that's what we're seeing. And that's what happened in Bucha. The nature of war. Two sides not willing to capitulate. The Ukrainian territorials, the ordinary citizens, picking up the rifle, defending their homes, the town, not in uniform, did some damage to Russian forces. But when you do that, you have to accept there's going to be consequences. And in this case, there was. The Russians came back, and there was no quarter given. Just as there was no quarter given to the Russian paratroopers who were attacked by the Ukrainian territorials. So interesting a video out there by the New York Times that covers this. If you read between the lines, and it is a little propagandish, obviously, it definitely tilts towards the Ukrainian side. And it's not what I would define as a gray film. It portrays the Russians in an unsavory light. However, they do let things slip that those who understand war, what the ramifications are of war, that this is what happened. So we'll continue to cover this and watch this very closely. Obviously, a lot of attention has been garnered because of what happened in Bucha and other places as well. But again, it's what happens. It's ugly, it's nasty, but this is what happens in war. War is not always honorable. And that's what we're seeing. So we'll continue to cover, we'll continue to watch what is happening and make more content for your consumption. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.